All right, so imagine this for a second, all right? Vladimir Putin, at that BRICS summit in Kazan,
Mm.
and he's holding up this banknote.
Yeah.
And what really catches your eye right away is that imagery. Yeah, the Indian flag right there with the Taj Mahal. Pretty powerful visual, right?
Absolutely. It really is, y- it's one of those images that kind of sticks with you, and it speaks volumes, I think, about, the message they're trying to send.
Yeah, and it sparked, a lot of reactions globally.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And it seems like the U.S. is looking at this, in some other moves by India and the other BRICS nations as like a direct challenge to the dollar, the U.S. dollar's dominance.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's almost like a bit of a power play, isn't it? These emerging economies are flexing their muscles a little bit, and the
Yeah.
U.S. isn't exactly thrilled about it,
No, they're not.
especially with India being part of the equation. India is a pretty big player on the world stage these
Right.
days.
And, it's both economically and politically too, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, their economy is growing at an incredible rate,
Yeah,
and they're wielding more and more influence on the global political landscape.
exactly. So in this deep dive, that's what we're going to try to unpack, all the stuff going on with de-dollarization, what's India's role in all of this, and how does history, play into what's happening today.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at the historical context here because it gives us a lot of insight into the current situation.
Yeah, we're going to be using, pulling from a YouTube transcript that we found that's got a pretty interesting perspective on all this.
Sounds intriguing.
And for all of you listening, you're obviously interested in this because it's a huge potential global shift, right?
Yeah, I mean, it could reshape the way the world does business.
Totally. And we're going to break it all down for you, try to make sense of it all without getting, too lost in the weeds.
We'll keep it clear and concise.
All right, so let's jump right in. This BRICS currency initiative.
Mm.
It's not just for show, right? That banknote Putin was holding up, that wasn't just a prop.
No, definitely not. I mean, it's a symbol, but it's also a very real plan that they're putting into action. And, like you said, it's got the flags of the founding members, right? Russia, India, China, and Brazil.
Yeah, all right there on the banknote.
It's a visual representation of their partnership in this initiative.
Yeah, and, the BRICS nations, they've been pretty open about what they want to. Do they want to make their own international payment system that's independent?
Right. It's about creating an alternative, a way to conduct global trade without having to rely on the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, and it's not just talk either. They're actually trying to make this happen.
Oh, yeah, they're very serious about this.
And the transcript we were looking at, it mentioned that there could be as many as 14 countries that are ready to use this BRICS currency.
Wow, that's a significant number.
Yeah, it's a lot. And if that many countries actually ditch the dollar, that could have huge economic implications.
Oh, yeah, that would be a major blow to the U.S. dollar's dominance.
Totally. And, it makes sense why the U.S. would be worried about this, especially with India being part of it.
Mm.
India's got a lot of economic power.
Right. And, it's interesting to think about why these countries are so keen on moving away from the dollar.
Yeah.
I mean, for many of them, it's about reducing their dependence on a currency that's controlled by a single country. The U.S.
They don't want to be at the mercy of U.S. policies.
Exactly. They want more autonomy, more control over their own financial destinies.
Okay, so let's add another piece to this puzzle, all right? The Atlantic Council,
Hmm.
that U.S. think tank, they released a report back in June,
Mm-hmm.
and they were talking about India and how much their gold reserves have been growing since 2017.
Oh, that's interesting.
And get this, in 2024, India was the second biggest buyer of gold globally,
Yeah.
and their purchases went up like 4 times compared to 2023.
Wow. That's a massive increase.
Yeah. So, what's really fascinating here is how the U.S. is reacting to India, buying up all this gold.
Right.
The transcript we were looking at, it suggests that the U.S. is pretty concerned about this.
Yeah. It makes you wonder if they see it as a threat.
Yeah, and they even brought up Libya, like comparing the situation to what happened in Libya.
Oh, wow. So they're drawing parallels to a country where the U.S. intervened militarily.
Yeah, and the transcript, it kind of suggests that the U.S. has a history of taking action when they feel like the dollar is being threatened.
It's a reminder that the U.S. has a lot at stake when it comes to the dollar's global dominance.
Totally.
And they haven't been afraid to use their power to protect it.
Right. So to really understand all of this, we need to look at those historical examples that we were just talking about. Libya in 2011 and Iraq, even earlier.
Okay. Yeah, those are definitely key events.
So let's start with Libya. Remember what happened back then? The U.S. said they were getting involved because of Muammar Gaddafi and his human rights abuses.
Right. That was the official reason given for the intervention.
Yeah, but the transcript, it brings up another side to the story.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it mentions these leaked emails from Hillary Clinton.
Oh, wow. Those were pretty controversial.
Yeah, they were. And according to these emails, Gaddafi was doing something pretty interesting. He had collected like a ton of gold and silver,
Hmm. How much are we talking about here?
like 150 tons of each.
Wow, that's a lot of precious metals.
Yeah, and he wanted to use all that gold and silver to back a new currency, a Pan-African currency called the Libyan dinar.
So he was trying to create a gold-backed currency for the whole continent.
That's what it looks like. And think about that, a gold-backed African currency that could have been huge.
Right. It would have been a major shift in the global financial landscape.
Totally. And the transcript, it suggests that this was a big concern for the U.S.
Yeah, it would have directly challenged the dollar's dominance in the region.
Right, and that's what de-dollarization is all about, right? Countries trying to move away from using the U.S. dollar for trade and finance.
Exactly. It's about diversifying their reserves, reducing their reliance on the dollar, and creating alternative systems.
And the transcript makes it pretty clear, the U.S. wasn't too happy about this whole Libyan dinar thing.
Yeah, it sounds like they saw it as a direct threat to their interests.
Yeah, and the outcome for Libya was pretty awful.
Yeah.
Their economy tanked, poverty skyrocketed, there was crazy inflation, people couldn't get food or medicine.
That's terrible.
And then there were the NATO airstrikes,
Oh, well.
which ended up killing a lot of civilians.
Yeah, the whole situation was a tragedy.
Yeah, it really was. And the transcript, it really drives home this point that there can be serious consequences for any country that tries to mess with the dollar's power.
Right. It's a reminder that the U.S. has a history of taking action to protect its financial interests, even if it means using military force.
Okay, so let's move on to Iraq now.
Yeah.
Back in the early 2000s, remember the U.S. invaded Iraq, and they said it was because Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction.
Right. That was the main justification given for the war.
But the transcript brings up another angle.
Yeah.
It mentions this book called Petrodollar Warfare.
I haven't read that one.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And it claims that Saddam Hussein made a big decision just a few months before the invasion. He decided to start selling Iraqi oil in euros instead of U.S. dollars.
Oh, wow. So he was trying to move away from the dollar in a really crucial sector?
Yeah, oil. That's like the lifeblood of the global economy.
Right. And using euros instead of dollars for oil transactions, that would have been a major blow to the petrodollar system.
Yeah, and you know what happened next, right? The U.S. invaded Iraq. Saddam Hussein was removed from power.
Yeah. And the country descended into chaos.
Yeah, it was a mess. There was regime change. Millions of people were displaced. Iraq has all that oil, but they became one of the poorest countries, and then you had the rise of terrorist groups like ISIS.
Right. It's been a very difficult and unstable situation ever since.
Yeah, and the transcript, it really emphasizes how much the U.S. values the dollar's role in the oil trade.
It's a cornerstone of their global economic power.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So these examples, Libya and Iraq, they really show why the U.S. might be worried about the BRICS initiatives, these moves towards de-dollarization.
It's understandable why they would see it as a potential threat.
Yeah, but it's also important to remember that India has its own history with currency influence. They've been down this road before.
Right.
The transcript talks about how back in the 1950s, the Indian rupee was actually a pretty strong global currency. People were using it all over the Middle East.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. And back then, the Gulf countries didn't even have their own currencies. Yeah. They were using the rupee for their trade.
Wow. So the rupee had a lot of regional clout back then.
Yeah, it did. And there was this idea, that the rupee could become a global reserve currency, just like the dollar is today.
It's fascinating to think about what might have been.
Yeah. But unfortunately, things didn't really work out that way. In the 1960s, the rupee kind of lost its mojo.
What happened?
Well, there were a few things. One big problem was gold smuggling.
Oh, smuggling. How did that tie into the currency?
Well, because the rupee was being used in both India and the Gulf.
Hmm.
It made it easier for people to smuggle gold into India.
Ah.
And the Indian government, they tried to stop this. So in 1959, they introduced this special Gulf rupee. It was a pink banknote. It was only supposed to be used in the Gulf countries.
So they were trying to control the flow of currency.
Yeah. And they also created a Hajj rupee, for Indian pilgrims who were going to Saudi Arabia.
So they had these different versions of the rupee for specific purposes.
Exactly. But then, India had a really rough time in the 1960s. They had the war with China in 62, and then the war with Pakistan in 65, And then there was a huge drought in Bihar in '66.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a lot of crises in a short period of time.
Yeah, and all of this really hurt the Indian economy. They had to import more stuff. Their trade deficit was growing, and they were running out of foreign
So
currency.
they were in a tough spot.
So they made a big decision. In 1966, they devalued the rupee
By how much?
by like 57%.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, it went from 4 rupees to the dollar to 7.5 rupees to the dollar.
That would definitely shake things up.
It did. The Gulf countries, they were holding a lot of rupees, and they got really worried.
Yeah, they must have thought that their money was suddenly worth a lot less.
Yeah, and they were worried that India might devalue the rupee again.
Yeah.
So they decided to create their own currencies. They didn't want to be dependent on the rupee anymore.
So that was the end of the rupee's dominance in the Gulf.
Yeah, pretty much the RBI stopped printing those special Gulf rupees and Hajj rupees, and that was kind of the end of India's dream of having a global reserve currency, at least for that time.
It's interesting how a series of events can completely change the trajectory of a currency.
Yeah, it really is. And the transcript, gives this example of Kuwait. They used to use the rupee back in the day, and now their dinar is super strong,
Yeah.
like worth over $3.
Yeah. That's a pretty stark contrast.
Yeah, it really shows you what could have been, if things had gone differently for the rupee.
And this historical context helps us understand the current situation with the US dollar. How it became so dominant.
Right, because today, something like 96% of global trade is done in U.S. dollars.
That's a staggering amount of control.
It is, and it gives the U.S. a ton of power. They can use the dollar to influence other countries. They can impose sanctions.
Yeah, and the transcripts highlight some examples of that, doesn't it?
It does, like what happened in Venezuela in 2019.
Right after those disputed elections.
Yeah, the U.S. basically said that Venezuela couldn't use U.S. dollars anymore, in international markets.
So they were cut off from the global financial system.
Pretty much, and it wrecked their economy.
Yeah.
Their oil sales plummeted, poverty went way up, there was hyperinflation, people were fleeing the country.
Yeah, it was a humanitarian crisis.
And Syria, too. The same year the U.S. hit them with sanctions and their currency, the Syrian pound, just collapsed.
Yeah.
It got so bad that people were using banknotes as like everyday items.
Wow, that's a sign of a truly desperate situation.
Yeah. And then there's Russia. After they went into Ukraine, the U.S. froze like $300 billion of their central bank reserves.
Yeah, that was a huge move.
It was. And then you've got the whole petrodollar system, the deal the U.S. made with OPEC countries back in the 70s where they agreed to only sell oil in U.S. dollars.
Right, that agreement really solidified the dollar's position as the world's dominant currency.
Yeah, so you can see why other countries might be a little nervous, about having so much reliance on the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, it makes them vulnerable to U.S. pressure.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the BRICS initiative. They're trying to create a counterbalance to all of this.
Right, a way to diversify and reduce their dependence on the dollar.
And the BRICS have grown a lot.
Yeah.
There are 9 members now.
Yeah, it's not just the original 4 anymore.
Nope. And together, they represent a big chunk of the global economy and the world's population.
How much are we talking?
Like 37% of global GDP and 45% of the world's people.
That's a significant force to be reckoned with.
It is. And their idea for a BRICS currency, it's designed to address those problems we were talking about with the dollar.
So how would it work?
Well, a big part of it is that it would be backed by gold, 40% gold reserves, and then the other 60% would be based on the value of the member country's own currencies.
Ah, so it's a hybrid system.
Yeah. And remember how India's been buying up all that gold? Well, that could be part of their plan, to have enough gold to back this new currency.
That makes sense. It would give the currency more credibility and stability.
Right, because instead of being tied to the dollar,
Yeah.
it would be anchored to gold and the collective economic strength of the BRICS nations.
It's a way to create a more independent financial system.
Exactly. And the idea is that this would protect them from U.S. sanctions, and they wouldn't need to use dollars for trade amongst themselves as much.
It's about creating a more resilient and autonomous system.
Right, so they'd have their own payment system and their own currency, and it would all operate outside of the dollar framework.
It's a pretty ambitious plan.
It is, but they seem determined to make it happen.
And India is playing a key role in all of this, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely. We talked about their gold reserves and how they've been steadily increasing.
Yeah.
They're like the 8th biggest holder of gold globally now.
Yeah, and they were the second biggest buyer of gold last year and the year before that, too.
Right, so they're clearly making moves to bolster their position.
Yeah.
And it seems like it's all connected to this BRICS currency idea.
It's all starting to come together.
But it's not just about the gold.
Yeah.
India's also been lending more money and giving more grants to other countries.
Yeah, they've been expanding their reach beyond just Asia.
Right. They've been giving loans to countries in Africa, Latin America, Eurasia, even Central Asia.
It's like they're trying to build up their influence around the world.
Yeah, and they even gave a loan to Mauritius in rupees, not in dollars.
That's interesting. It's like they're promoting the use of their own currency.
Right. And then in July of 2022, India made a big announcement. They said they were open to settling international trade in rupees.
Oh, wow. So they're making it easier for other countries to trade with them directly in rupees.
Yeah, and a bunch of countries have already opened these special accounts in India called Vostro accounts.
The Vostro accounts.
Yeah, it's basically like a bank account that a foreign bank holds in India,
Oh.
and it's denominated in rupees.
So it allows for direct transactions between Indian and foreign entities in their own currencies.
Exactly. They can bypass the dollar completely.
That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it is. And 18 countries have already opened these Vostro accounts, including some big ones like Russia, Israel, UK, even New Zealand.
Wow. So there's definitely interest in this.
Yeah, and another 22 countries have said they're thinking about it too.
So there's momentum building.
Yeah, and for Indian traders, this is a good thing. It means lower costs and fewer risks.
Right, because they don't have to worry about exchange rate fluctuations or those fees for converting to dollars.
Exactly. So on the surface, it looks like India is doing a lot to make the rupee stronger and maybe even help this whole de-dollarization thing along.
Yeah, it seems like they're moving in that direction.
But here's the weird thing. The transcript points this out. Indian officials keep saying that they're not trying to de-dollarize.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like the foreign minister, the finance minister, the RBI governor, they've all said that their goal is just to promote the rupee.
So what's going on there?
Well, the transcript suggests that it might have to do with China.
China. How so?
Well, think about it. If the dollar starts to lose its grip, who's probably going to benefit the most?
China.
Yeah, and India and China, they have a complicated relationship.
Right, they're both big, powerful countries in the same region.
And they're kind of rivals, So India might not be thrilled about the idea of China's currency, the yuan becoming the next global reserve currency.
It makes sense they wouldn't want to do anything that would help their rival gain more power.
Yeah, so maybe they're trying to walk this fine line, strengthening the rupee, but not going all in on de-dollarization.
It's a delicate balancing act.
It is, and the transcript mentions this book by India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar. It's called The India Way, and it talks about how India needs to play the game, strategically managing their relationships with different countries like the U.S., China, Russia, Europe, Japan.
So it's about finding their place in a multipolar world.
Exactly. And maybe de-dollarization is just one piece of that puzzle.
Yeah.
It's a way for India to gain more leverage to become a bigger player on the global stage.
It's about securing their own interests in a changing world.
Right. And it's not just about de-dollarization. It's about becoming an economic superpower.
Yeah, it's about shaping the future global order.
All right. So as we wrap this up, we've covered a lot of ground here, but it leaves us with a big question.
What's that?
Well, given everything we've talked about, the history of the geopolitics, the economics of it all, what do you think are the biggest challenges and the biggest opportunities for India as they try to carve out a bigger role for themselves in the global economy?
That's a really thought-provoking question, and I think it's something that each listener needs to grapple with on their own, considering all the complexities we've discussed.
Right.
But I think some key things to consider are the potential for sustained economic growth in India, the need to build greater confidence in the rupee as a stable and reliable currency for international transactions, and of course the challenge of navigating those intricate global power dynamics, finding that sweet spot where they can exert their influence without stepping on too many toes.
Yeah, it's a tough road ahead.
It is, but it's also an exciting time to be watching India. They're at a pivotal moment, and it'll be interesting to see how they play their cards.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this. Share your insights, your analysis. Let's keep the conversation going.
Let us know what you think.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Take care.
You too.